Hello, everyone. We're here today with Associate Professor Jane Johnston of the University of Queensland to discuss the role of public information officers. So before we really get started, could you please briefly outline your professional background for our listeners?
Yes, thanks, Melissa, and thanks very much for having me on your podcast series. My background in research into the courts and public information officers stemmed from a practice background as a journalist. My first career was as a journalist, and I used to write the law lists for the newspaper. They had to be handwritten back then or typewritten, and I started reporting on the courts as a cadet. Started at the magistrates' courts, and then I also reported at the Superior Courts in Brisbane, and then I went overseas and worked in the UK for a while, and I just got the taste for it because I just loved the culture and the language and the sense of place about being in the courts. So there was a real atmosphere there. When I became an academic about 10 years later, I just thought this is the career that I want to investigate the relationship between the courts and the public. And so it was, I guess it was a bit of a calling. I just really loved investigating how the courts could be translated to the public via the media. And then subsequently I did my master's in that area and my PhD, and a lot of my studies since that period of time, a lot of my research has looked at the courts and the public and the media.
Excellent. I didn't realize you had gotten started with court reporting, but that makes sense that you have such a close connection to the court system. So speaking of translating the court for the public, could you explain the reasoning behind the decision to create public information officers positions within Australia?
Yes, sure. So the story of the development of the role, really it began, as far as I'm aware, in the US. The first recorded public information officer was at the Supreme Court of the United States as far back as the 1930s, actually. But in Australia, the first appointment was to the Family Court of Australia in 1986. The Family Court was new at the time, just a few years old, and it was a controversial court. The first public information officer was a newspaper journalist, but she was also a law graduate, so she had a law degree as well. And this was a preference for the courts, and it still is a popular combination for people in that role, law and journalism. Her name was Gabrielle Traynor, and so she was the first public information officer in Australia, and she set up the communication systems based in that court in Sydney. So that included everything from multilingual resources for parties to media liaison roles, and also to managing crises. Because it was a controversial court, there were in fact several bombings of courts and judges' residences back then. And one of the judges' wives was tragically killed during a bombing in the 1980s. So Gabrielle had to do everything. She was a person that was translating for videos for Greeks and Italians and Vietnamese, and she was managing crisis communication. So it was a huge job for one person. And then over the years, in the 1990s, there were a lot more appointments that occurred, particularly in the superior courts in Australia. So the Supreme Court of New South Wales was next, then the Supreme Court of Victoria, and so it kind of blossomed around Australia. So there are several reasons, I guess, that preempted or that precipitated the setting up of the public information role. The first one, or probably the main one, was to work with the media. The courts and the media were at a low ebb in the 1990s. They didn't have a good relationship, and it was clear that the courts had to provide a focus for resourcing the media to help them in terms of accuracy and access to information. A flow-on from this was that judges were under fire, both from the media and from politicians. And in some courts, the public information role was also to assist the judiciary. And then a third element, which was important and continues to be, is the development of an engagement and a liaison role, so outreach with the public or to the public. to take the courts to the people and to open up the courts for the community to come in to really make that open justice imperative happen so people felt comfortable. I wanted to just share a quick point there because if you allow me just to go more broadly than Australia, last year I was at a conference of court public information officers in the US, and that was opened by the Chief Justice of Ohio, Justice Maureen O'Connor. And I'd like to quote what she said in opening, because I thought it just really summed up the way public information officers have been felt or how judges have felt about them, both in Australia and internationally. And she said, our dependence on public information officers or our dependence on public information teams is one of the strongest dependencies we have. She said, they help us put our best foot forward. Courts have always been a centrepiece of our democracy. While the mission of public service remains, courts today are different to even 30 years ago. Now they are proactive places and courts have become agents of change. I thought that was a really great quote.
Yeah, that is fantastic. I feel like now I have so many more questions. I just wanted to ask briefly, you mentioned that there were court bombings. This is something very serious. I wasn't aware of this. Is this just because people were dissatisfied with the decisions that the court was making?
Yeah, look, to be perfectly honest, I don't know much of the background. I've only read the media reports of the bombings. I believe there was one at a judge's home and there was at least one in one of the courts. And that was because the family court was brand new and it was controversial. There were decisions that were being made. Our divorce laws had changed previous to that. And yeah, a lot of dissatisfied people, obviously at the extreme. There was also a shooting of a judge prior to the appointment of Gabrielle. So yeah, these were people who were hostile and angry, and that particular court was tragically a very bad target.
Mm-hmm. It definitely highlights the importance of public trust in the judiciary.
Absolutely.
Of building that trust. So over the years, how did the public information officers and the judiciaries keep track of the effectiveness of the work of the public information officers? You mentioned that one of the goals was to improve the accuracy of reporting. Is that one metric that they used, or how did they track that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I suppose partially that they've kept track by people like me who've studied it. I don't think there's ever been a study that has absolutely aligned the metrics of accuracy with access and public information officers. But certainly there have been some studies that have found that the media have been very happy with having access. I did a study in the Queensland courts. Queensland is the state I live in. It's the last state to appoint a public information officer. And in 2016, when they appointed a public information officer for a one-year trial, they asked me to evaluate that 1 year. And so I went to judges and administrators and the media to find out how they felt about that 1 year, how successful had it been. And overwhelmingly, the response was that the role had been effective in facilitating the media. The media loved having someone to assist them, and almost all said that it helped with their accuracy in reporting. And similarly, the judges and administrators really appreciated having someone in the role. So as I said, I don't think there's been any quantitative studies of the positive or negative alignment, but this is one area that I'm actually interested in pursuing in the future. Certainly, anecdotally, the PIO role has brokered very successful relationships with the courts and the media.
Excellent. No, I mean, it sounds like you mentioned anecdotally that it's been a really positive development. So, as you mentioned, it'd be really interesting to track that.
Absolutely. I mean, there have been, if I can just jump in there have been a lot of other initiatives as well. So, for example, the courts the courts can, through the PIO, they can not only work with the media, but they can bypass the media now. And I guess, we'll probably talk a little bit about social media later in the talk, but the courts now can stream their audio and their video judgment summaries have been developed by public information officers, and that makes accuracy, that can heighten accuracy. When you've got an 800 or 900 page document, that's the judgment, and then you get a 2-page judgment summary, that's got to help the court, the media, right? So we get far higher numbers now of TV sentences on the television news. Even podcasts have now been developed by the PIOs. So access and accuracy have really been heightened.
So maybe on a more practical level, how can public information officers best liaise with the media? So, you mentioned you can kind of bypass them by streaming videos, but what are some of the best practices in liaising with the media?
Yeah. So really in much the same way as any professional communication person liaises with the media. So they use email, they use phone. In some courts, they've set up special paperwork systems for journalists to access evidence, and that will go through the Public Information Officer's department. But something newer is through Twitter. So the Supreme Court of Victoria was our first court in this country to use Twitter. And they did so, I found out through my research, they did so partly so that they could actually follow reporters and reporters could follow them. So now, because we know that reporters use Twitter as a main social media tool, so it gives the courts then a direct line of communication with the media through Twitter.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Twitter. How do you think social media in general has changed the way that public information officers have to operate?
Yeah, it's changed it phenomenally, really. And I think if you cast that more broadly into digital media, which of course includes social media, it's changed the way government, corporates and NGOs all operate. But why it's so special, I guess, with the courts is that the courts have been relatively slow adopters of social and digital media. And I think this is partly because of the traditions and the culture of the courts. So they have been a bit slower to make the transition. So in my research, PIOs have told me that they have to tread a pretty fine line between affecting change and not causing any sort of revolution in the courts. And we know that social media has been revolutionary. I wrote an article for the Judicial Officers Bulletin, which is a Australian journal for the judiciary, in which I drew an analogy between Aesop's fable of the hare and the tortoise and social media and the courts. And I was just going to read a little bit from that because it's just basically my opening line there. Aesop's slow and steady cautionary approach is best. This old fable provides sage advice for this new media phenomenon. Hastening slowly in the uptake of social media calls for a combination of digital media literacy, including an understanding of its fragmented and complex parts, and a strategic approach to its use. So, I mean, this is advice for the judiciary, but for public information officers, it's just simply part of their communication toolkit, as it is for communication and media managers in every sector.
So it's not just the courts that are online, of course, or the reporters, but it's also the general public that are out there on social media. Yeah. And we've gotten a lot of questions about what judges should do if they're publicly criticized on social media, because a lot of them, of course, they want to rectify the issue and explain themselves, but usually this isn't the best approach. So, how can public information officers help to handle situations where judges are publicly criticized like this?
It's such a big issue. I think I'd respond really with a standard advice for any professional use of social media. And you've kind of touched on that in your question. Respond only if to correct. Because as we know, social media is not a place for public stouches. And public information officers know this. They're professionals. So they're on hand for advice to the media, to assist them, for advice to the judiciary, to assist them in knowing what to say and when to say it, but also what not to say, because social media gives and it takes away. And we know that it's an environment that affords a lot less control for anybody, for judges, for politicians. And people who have been taken down by social media have been often those people that have gotten into stouches. And you're not going to win, because there's always going to be somebody that will come back and try and trump you. So the best advice really then, I think, with all of these, whether it's a blogger or a journalist or or the public, members of the public, is to be proactive and for courts to have relationships already built so that if things go sour, that you feel like you're in a trust bank situation. You've got some credits in your trust bank. Because it's only in extreme cases that courts can request posts to be taken down. We know that, and only if it's incorrect. And anyway, by then the damage can be done. So I think the main thing is to try and be proactive, to be positive. We have a really amazing police service in Queensland that have two different parts of their communication channels. They have proactive media and they have reactive media. And I think that the idea, I wrote about this years ago, and I was speaking to the Director of Public Affairs the other day saying, I'm so excited to see this being put in place. This notion that there should be an entire section of their communication and media team dedicated to positive, proactive media so that they develop the relationships that stand them in good stead when things start to go sour. I think that's my advice.
Yes, no, definitely very good advice. I thought it was very interesting what you said, that public information officers are professionals who know what to say and when to say it. I wanted to ask whether or not there's education provided to judges to kind of try and develop some of the same skills.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I do think that there have been great steps forward, but I think there's still a way to go to educating judges and prioritising media literacy within the judiciary. I guess the bottom line is the judiciary have got to want it, but the reality is I believe that the judiciary actually really do need it. There have been some great advances in recent years. In Australia, just a few examples, the Australasian Institute of Judicial Administration, or what we call the AIJA, they have Judicial Guide to Judicial Conduct. And recently, I think about 2 years ago, they added a whole new chapter on social media. And that's really useful. That's kind of a stock standard guide for the media for the judiciary to have. But I guess coming back to what training for judges, I think also the public information officers find that it's part of their role is working with the judges. Yeah. And I think, though, it does require constant vigilance and resourcing. So the courts need to, I think, and the funders of the courts, wherever that may come from, need to rethink the paradigm, I think, from being kind of passively acted on by the media to proactively acting within the media. And that means that you need to be very literate in this space.
That's really interesting about the AIJA resource on social media, because the network also recently developed a set of guidelines for judges on how to use social media. So it's definitely an important emerging area. What kind of first steps would you suggest to judiciaries who want to improve their relationship? Would you suggest that they need to start by being more proactive, or I suppose the first step would maybe be hiring a public information officer. Yeah. But kind of what would your advice be to judiciaries who know that they need to work on their relationship with the media or with the press?
Yeah, I think that we've certainly been through that in Australia in the 1990s when the PIOs really came on board. And without a shadow of a doubt, they found that meeting with the media was important, talking to them, acknowledging that they both have a part to play in the system. I guess a little bit more practically, write a blog, talk to a school group, talk to a group of senior citizens, maybe invite the media, obviously do it for the right reasons, not for the publicity, but because you want to engage with the public and get out there. And I think that's important in terms of people feeling that they can connect with the human side of the judiciary, because that's still I think, people are still a little bit nervous about, I can't talk to a judge, I mean, there's a really great example of a judge in Austin, Texas, in the US. His name's Judge John Willits. He's got 100,000 followers on Twitter. And he doesn't tweet about the law at all. My favourite tweet of his ever was he posted this amazing photograph of a full moon bouncing through a basketball hoop as if the moon was the ball. And it was just this beautiful photograph. And I thought that's what we call something that's a sticky memory, right? Something that stays with you. And not everyone's going to take to social media, but that's one option. And I would reiterate to hasten slowly, like in Aesop's fables, but I do think that's an option that a lot of judges are considering at the moment.
So do you think, this is very interesting. I wasn't aware of this judge from Austin. Do you think it kind of helps to give a human face to the courts, to see that judges are regular people?
Absolutely.
Who have regular hobbies, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that they can be pretty good photographers as well. I mean, it was a beautiful photograph. So I think that it's a real point of connection where people see, oh, wow, the judge can take a really cool picture and he doesn't have to comment about anything that's going on in the law.
Thank you, Professor Johnston. And for everyone else listening, please stay tuned for more episodes of the Global Judicial Integrity Network podcast series. Thank you.